So, Shekhar, I just was extremely inspired looking at your background, the body of work that you have done. And I wanted to kind of kick off this conversation with the fact that you have about close to 150 patents, and this is across supply chain, various domains. And how do you really look at, how do you come up with these patterns, especially when they are from diverse domains? So, where is the starting point for your thinking, and what's the operating system that you actually apply to actually get somewhere to where you have reached today?
I guess it's an interesting question. A lot of my ideas, to be honest with you, um, are really function of three things.
Mm-hmm.
First is the sort of the nurturing where I came from. Okay. The second is the context you get placed into.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And the third, I would say, is the value and the virtue that like my parents were able to instill.
Mm-hmm.
Right. The combination of those three things is largely the reason why I have been on this incredible journey in my life. And I cannot take credit for everything or anything I have done. It was all those questions that kid like a 3-year-old like questions that people ask, leaders ask of you, which actually results in you having a deeper thought of why are they asking it, is it relevant, and what are the consequences of those. And so to be able to probe and get into that was the reason why I was able to uh, create those inventions in the first place, and they had like some meaningful and very profound effect. So let's unpack
Yeah.
each of these three things, right? Now, the first one is the nurturing,
Mm-hmm.
right? uh, so if I look at my own experience, I grew up in slums in India, in fact, like right around here, in Secunderabad, and it's the second biggest slum in India.
Oh,
Okay.
okay.
So, and my father used to deliver telegrams for 175 rupees. My mother was largely she did not have schooling, but like school doesn't really determine your wisdom and intelligence scale in life. It is like your practical experiences that actually
Yeah.
is important. So she was like padikada medavi
Yeah.
in Tamil, which is
Yeah.
meaning you're the uneducated, intelligent, wisdom
Yeah.
person, right? Um, so uh, so for me, having grown up in that context, um, everything that we had to do was think beyond our existing means that we were provided. Like example, I used to when I was a kid, and we couldn't afford like textbooks or formal education or like any of those things, and my mother and my father had to fight for every one of those things.
Yeah.
It's very typical of every Indian family here, like the mother pawns the jewelry, the father is working hard, the guy who's the servant maid's kid actually becomes a GM of some factory. It's a common story everyone can relate to. And so my story is very similar like that. So my mother would actually took me to the printing press,
Mm-hmm.
Deccan Chronicle. And I used to look at these printing machines, offset printing machines.
Okay.
And I was very fascinated by looking at the printing machines. And I would say, you know what, like this is so cool. And I used to ask my mom, what does it do? So she used to say it prints. So, and then I thought like, why can't I print?
Yeah.
And then I would like go sit, and I learned how to take a textbook and create a mirror image of this textbook.
Okay.
Right? Like literally I could sketch.
Okay.
Okay. And then that book, I made sure, and my mother made sure, not only I read that, but everyone like who's in the same neighborhood, who's actually aspiring to go into education and wants to access knowledge, has an access to that.
Okay.
right? So that was actually built, like, or like I want to have, in those days, like, having Ganesha in the neighborhood used to be a very big thing. So instead of, like, going and asking everyone for money and contribution, because we were all from slums, like, who can contribute to who,
Yeah.
right? So we used to assemble mechanical parts and build like mechanical Ganesha.
Okay.
And this is like, when I was like a 9-year-old kid, 10-year-old kid, 11-year-old kid, like, so I think like that context actually gave me, that nurturing actually gave me the ingenuity to think beyond like what is you take for granted mostly. When you have 10 rupees and you want to buy Ganesha, you'll go buy Ganesha from the market.
Yeah.
But when you don't have 10 rupees and you want, like, you have fascination to build a Ganesha, you will build a Ganesha.
So working within constraints.
Absolutely. That's the first. And so that is the nurture piece of it, right? The second one is the context piece of it. So all companies that I worked for make money despite themselves.
Great.
Right? So they are so lethargic. There is so much waste. There is so much organizational, like, sort of like, this.
Trophy.
Yeah, and also the companies which were built, the founder who built it, and, like, the early members who built it, they have created something remarkable, and everyone is riding on that. It's like a legacy ride, right?
Correct.
Like, your father was the richest guy, and then you live a lavish life.
Yeah.
That is exactly what most companies are actually doing today, right? So they rarely ask the question, the context of how we operate, is it even relevant for today's condition? Right? So Coke used to operate the same way that it operated in 1970. Right? They used to have a truck where all the products is assembled like a warehouse on a truck. And they used to have a guy who's like, 250 pounds. He's driving the truck. He's opening every bay and every bin. And he's taking the product, running it into the store. Well, that's a very old way of thinking.
Yeah.
Right? And particularly when you had only 10 products, easy to fetch. But when you have 1,000 products, very difficult to fetch, because like everything is buried. Now you're like spending like 10 times as much or 100 times as much.
Yeah.
So the cost of doing business just goes up significantly. So people rarely think, when was this created? In what context it was created? And are we operating in the same reality? And where is the future heading? And when you ask that question, and when you understand the assumptions, you begin to unpack. That unpacking should be done in a way that you focus on the fundamentals. Right? So if the truck is a warehouse, well, the work never belongs on the road. It actually belongs in the warehouse.
Yeah.
Right? So bring back the work to the warehouse and build it in a way that it could be delivered with one touch, not with 37 touches. So every one of my businesses that I worked for had this context misalignment problem.
Yeah. And allowing you to really pushing yourself to say, let me think from first principles.
Absolutely. Right? And then, because there are also 2 or 3 things at play at that time, right? The confluence of where the technology is, right? What is the need of the hour for the time that you're actually innovating, and into the future? Can you see the future? So you got to have a little bit of prism into the future.
Yeah.
And then the third one is basically like, how do you create an organization that is accepting of the change? Because change is very difficult, and antibodies usually kick in with change.
Correct.
Right? So now mastering that art was very critical. And because I got thrown early into my career into that sector. So think about beverages. Beverages in 2000 in United States was all soda in 90s. Even today it is.
Yeah.
But in 2000s, there was a conscious revolution that was happening about putting health first.
Yeah.
So people were going to healthier choices, which means diversified product portfolio. You don't not only sell cola, but you also sell like fruit juice. You
Yeah.
also sell water. You also sell energy drinks. You
Mm.
also sell chips, and
Mm.
you also sell other, like, snacks and other things. So as a CPG company, a consumer products good company, you have to diversify. That way, your business, which was actually generating cash by selling cola, if it's not the future, and if that's where people are headed, healthy choices, then how do you create an infrastructure which is able to accommodate that? And so we had to go innovate on all these fronts. Okay. And then the third one is the virtues and the values that, like, you grow up with. My mother, actually, I went to a Jesuit school.
Mm.
My mother knew this amazing reporter, because my mother also was working in Deccan Chronicle,
Mm.
and literally her job was to strip the ad, pin the ad, and basically send an invoice.
Okay.
Okay, so she knew the reporters, and the reporters' uncle used to run St. Patrick's High School.
Okay.
Okay, and so my both my brothers got lucky, and they ended up going to the school. Then, like, they said, like, you are the third son,
Mm.
you can't get in.
Mm.
And they asked me, like, what is this color? I kept saying it's blue. It was gray.
Mm. Ah.
So then they said, obviously rejected, third son. And there was a, obviously at that time, right, like, when you come from slums, people were more fascinated about what religion you belong to. And, like, the ask was, can we change our affiliation to the religion?
Mm.
Which we did not want to.
Okay.
Right. So my mother thought it was unjust for me to be rejected because of those reasons, and the fact that both my brothers are going to go to a better school than I, she wasn't going to take that for granted. And she stood like 365 days in front of the headmaster's school, office every day during the Mars. She wouldn't protest. She would just stand there till that guy got basically completely vexed and said, you know what, like, bring your son and join him.
Fantastic.
Okay, so that persistence, um, and when we could not afford education, she pawned her wedding ring.
Mm.
So this is the met,
Mm.
right? And that is a symbol of the fact that someone chose her.
Mm.
Right, that's her identity. Like, a woman's identity is the marriage, when when she's married to someone, that someone actually thinks of that person as their own.
Mm.
That's the representation, and she's willing to give that up on the unknown future I had. Right. So when you have that sort of mindset, then everything that you do every day, it subconsciously is imprinted in your brain that you don't want to let that person down.
Mm.
And so was my father's sacrifices. So that virtue and the values that they created, which is one of hard work, one of persistence, one of basically being empathetic.
Mm.
And empathy doesn't mean that, like, you have to simply listen to everyone and basically agree with everything they're saying.
Yeah.
It is about, like, having a point of view, but, like, understanding others' point of view at the same time. Right.
Exactly.
Like, so that sort of, like, the framing of what I had is the genesis for why I became who I became in my life. Nothing in life is coincidence. Everything in life is contractual. You, in this world, you already have come with a contract. You have decided before you came who's your father, who's your mother, what context, how are you going to, the fact that, like, I lived in slums, preordained.
Mm.
The fact that, like, basically I worked for all these companies, preordained. It was just that angels showed up in my life along the journey, and they opened the doors for me. And I had unconsciously, like, got into problems where I was able to explore new ideas for new companies. And when you are constantly living in that loop,
Mm.
and you're only focused on that loop, then you become what you just told, which is to be able to be an innovator, the unconscious innovator.
Yeah.